Hello.
Hello, hello everyone. Hi V, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, Anita?
Good, long time no see.
I know, right? And today we're in
I
like
know.
a different scenario, as everyone can see behind us.
Exactly, a historic scenario, correct?
Yep. Yep. Very familiar too.
Very familiar too. All right, guys. As per usual, welcome to Approaching Your Future with your hosts Dana Khan and Victor Rivero, where we take steps towards your goals. And today we have a really cool topic. We know we haven't been present in a while. We had the conference, which was a great success. So thank you for everyone who attended. But today we have a really cool topic. We're going to be talking about the history of Boston. And I think that it's something great to keep in mind as we are living in this beautiful historic city. So I know V is a history lover, so I'm going to let him maybe talk about it, about his love for history. How did you start learning about history? Because I know you actually have a lot of knowledge.
Oh, thank you, Anita. I mean, like you said, I love history, and I think it's something that's always been a part of me since I was like really young. I used to love Brazilian history, which involves like the whole discovery of South America and how the Portuguese arrived in Brazil and so on and so forth. And I think it's just really interesting. One of the reasons why and like how like one of the reasons why I had to learn a lot of US history was because of college. I had to take a test that was from the 1500s until 1877, which is basically from the discovery until the death of Lincoln. And I loved it because I learned that after a while, after I was living in the United States, and a lot of what I learned in history kind of like explained a lot of different things, you know, about living there and like the way people are and this whole American background, like so kind of like driven, motivated, and so diverse. So I guess like I have a lot to talk about in those terms.
I'm excited. I'm excited, V. So that is true. V is a history connoisseur, and we're excited to talk about it. But I'm gonna share my screen right now, and I'm gonna show you guys a little presentation that we put together.
Yeah.
Keep in mind it has a few notes.
Hmm.
Let me see if I can share the Chrome tab.
Yes. And that's kind of like that will help us lead a little bit like by the dates. That's another thing about history. It's like imagine that you don't really check through the pages of the book. You check through the dates in the book, right? And
Exactly.
that's kind of like how Donna divided it, and really good.
Exactly. So this is a little bit of a timeline, guys. It's basic history of Boston, our beautiful Boston, and we're gonna talk
Yes.
about it and take you guys all the way up to the 20th century. So let's start. Let's get ahead. Let's start with
Okay.
the how. Yes, V.
No, you can do this introduction, and I will pick up from you.
Okay, perfect. Happily. Um, how do we start, guys? In 1630 AD, the Puritans arrived. The Puritans, or also known as the Pilgrims, um,
Yes.
are come from England, correct, V?
Correct. So another thing, so right on 1630, like you said, the Pilgrims and that were Puritans. They came all the way from England, and the first place they arrived was Plymouth, which is in Massachusetts. And in addition to that, I mean, like that was the closest to Boston that the Pilgrims ever arrived, right? Like that was one of their main, it was one of their main places. And there are a lot of interesting historical facts that includes their arrival, but we're not gonna be able to go in full detail because it's a lot, right? But that's right. So the Puritans they arrived from England because in England back then the crown at the time there were a lot of religious disputes. Like there are a lot of religious issues between the family of the king, the family of the queen, and there was like a few things going on between England and Spain that's definitely worth understanding because that explains that one of the treaties done by Portugal, England, and Spain dividing the Americas and deciding who would go where. and then the Portuguese and Spanish ended up in the deep South America, and most of the British ended up in the north of
To
America.
America.
So yeah, and it's really interesting. So like the Puritans, they arrived in Plymouth, and that's where they started being. That's where they situated themselves. One of the reasons why they were only Puritans, because the Puritans were being followed in England. So that's why specifically the Puritans were the ones, because they were the most, I would say, in terms of religion, and um, I'm not sure if like the Puritans were from the there's like different types of church at the time in the crown.
Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church was not a big thing in England, and the Puritans were. I have to check that one for you, but the Puritans, they were being followed for being more extremists in terms of religion, and a lot of people used to pick on them. So when they arrived in North America, they kind of created their community, but they weren't necessarily the most inviting people, because Puritans only wanted to hang out with Puritans at the time, which ended up changing so on in history. So they were the first ones. And that explains why Massachusetts is so full of history and it's so full of knowledge, because the Puritans, they had different values back in history. When British really arrived in the United States, they went to Virginia. You know why, Donna?
Why?
Tobacco.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, Virginia had they used to export so much tobacco from there, and that used to kind of they used to outsource that to the whole world. Actually, tobacco was not much of a thing until the British arrived in North America, which is really interesting too. You know, it
Wow.
became more commercialized. So the South of the United States was more in commerce and, you know, labor, hand work. The North, where the Puritans arrived, which is near Boston, they were more into religion, reading. They wanted to teach kids how to be religious and how to pass forward their habits and their culture as Puritans.
So
So
some form of crusade.
pretty much I would say like yes, it's like they were escaping, you know, England, and when they arrived, they wanted to create their own space, you know, but they were still under the domain of the crown. You know, that land wasn't necessarily theirs. They found that land after the British had arrived already in the South in Virginia. So that came a
Oh,
little bit later, like you say, like in 1630. In the 1630s, that's the time where like Massachusetts, let's say, was born almost, because they arrived in Plymouth,
yes,
which
actually, that is so interesting, and it's interesting to see how like close it is to us. I apologize for the sound behind me, by the way, guys. But I also wanted to add to that, V. I read that the reason why they called it New England it was to try to make it like more comfortable for foreigners, for British people to come in and get adjusted, and that's why they called it New England. That's why we are in New England. So it's pretty
yes,
cool.
that's correct. That's correct. And it was in New England, and it was like, in terms of intelligence, academia, and things like this, it was definitely new. It was like a whole new wave of understanding things. Um, but you know, that's what's interesting about history, because it's one thing leading to another. Of course, not too long after the arrival of the Puritans, like a little bit more after 100 years, there was the Great Awakening, you know, and all these factors kind of like really affected the history of the United States, because everything that happened around the world at that time um, inspired people to kind of to replicate and to, you know, be a part of like history in different ways, like people to do different things. So it was like really interesting, and that those times were interesting, you know. And it's good to say too that like right on the north of Boston, there were a lot of indigenous communities too, And in the northeast of the United States, also they had a lot of indigenous communities, and that the land was being mainly disputed by the British and the French, who had arrived in the very extreme north around Canada back then in history too, a long time ago. But the difference is that the French had they had different interests. They weren't really trying to create the New England, like you said, Donna. The French really wanted to invest in culture, fashion. They wanted to export materials that could be used for clothing and so on.
That's
So
interesting.
their goal was never to dominate, and that was the difference between the French and the British. And of course, that changed throughout time. A lot of times, there were a lot of wars, but that's kind of like how that area was established. Like the area of Massachusetts, like New England, Boston, right? It was the hub of all this. And like you say, from 1631, 1680, the Puritans built Boston, and you know that's kind of like the real start of Boston. Because although we're talking about U.S. history, the history of the United States includes the whole United States, but right now we're trying to focus in Boston. So it's
In
kind of like
Boston.
always try to filter a little bit to get to the point.
Yes, no, I got you. But it's important to take everything into consideration because it genuinely all builds into the context of this history. I think it's very important.
Yes,
And
true.
as you said, we in 1631 to 1680, the Puritans built Boston, and Boston starts to flourish. And then Massachusetts become the Boston becomes a Massachusetts Bay colony, which means that it loses the right to self-govern, right? And this
Yeah,
is like years and years before the American
yeah.
Revolution.
Yeah, which is interesting too. That's another it's a very important fact of history. It's like when they say Massachusetts Bay Colony, it really tells a lot about like how at the time the British was so worried into keeping that land for them, and for so many reasons, but also because they were in debt. Like they weren't making as much as they thought. That age of discovery wasn't as profitable at that time as they thought it would be. They weren't necessarily seeing that as a long-term investment. They wanted to go there, produce, and leave, and not
Right,
leave, but export. They wanted to have
right,
domain and just extract as much as they could from the land. So that's why
exactly.
they say Massachusetts Bay Colony. The colonial factor is huge because that's one of the starts of like the revolution. It's this thing of the British really trying to make the whole America their colony, and that comes with a lot of issues, which you can see on 1761 and 1772. No taxation without representation. That was also another interesting part of history. Do you know anything about it, Anita?
I know just a bit, V, and you're welcome to fill in.
Please.
I just know a bit because I recently went to the Boston Tea Party Museum, and that's how I learned more about this. But from what I understand, um, the English, I'm sorry, the British start increasing taxes and doing some form of a lot of taxes because they wanted to make more money, of course. And Boston natives start getting really mad about that, and it starts the no taxation without representation, which leads to the Boston Massacre, in which they are, I think, in front of some form of government building. Um, Protesting against the British soldiers or the British Parliament in Boston, and these British soldiers come out and decide to shoot. I think five civilians. It says, yeah, five civilians. And that's how the tensions start escalating incredibly, which leads to then the Boston Tea Party, which, from what I understand, it happens when the King of England decides to basically like uh, put many boats, bring many like tea boats to the Boston Harbor to a point that it like blocks every other boat from coming in and out. So basically, the people from Boston need to unload the boats in order to get more commerce in and out and more
Yeah.
uh, trade, right?
Yeah.
And and it's basically their form of saying like you're not gonna get any food or trade if you don't do what we're asking. And then the Boston Tea happens is the famous Boston Tea Party, right? That's led by the Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams. Actually, I want to hear your version because this is what I know from the museum. I want to know what you know.
No, well, it's very accurate. There are a few details on why these things happen, which are more like not only political but a bit psychological. You know,
Okay.
um, so so here's the thing. What was really interesting was that at that time, the British Crown was basically deciding what products would be outsourced to America. So basically, like in North America, British Crown would decide who is buying what, like what type of products you want, kind of establishing monopolies in different businesses of the area, right? Which is completely unfair because at that time people had a different level of intelligence and they knew that that wasn't a fair way to do businesses, right? And a lot of these things happened because the British Crown also had monopoly over the tea, and they used to export from the Indians and from India to other places and so on. You know what I mean? So that's what's interesting because the British basically had this big source of tea, and they were providing this tea to Massachusetts. They were taxing them a lot, pretty much. They were releasing different acts, like the Stamp Act, which was the tea, related to the tea.
Right, right.
Exactly. So it was like really interesting because people were getting mad at this side of like the British Crown controlling the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This whole thing of deciding what to buy, what to do. So people started gathering and they started to revolt. They started to protest. And one of the first things they did, look, so interesting how Massachusetts was already so educated at the time. They tried to protest in the most polite way possible through advertising, through campaigning, using journals and just saying it's not fair. Let's boycott them so they can do something and help us. I mean, like at the time, a
Right.
lot of people who were living there, they were also British citizens, and they felt like that side of their British citizenship wasn't being really respected.
Right, exactly. That's so
So that
interesting.
was really, really interesting. But yeah, have you heard about it? Like about these details of like how they protest? They would like what was interesting back then is that most of the households, a lot of the things that were purchased by women. So the women were the ones leading a lot of like protests, kind of like from women to women, like you should not buy this, you should not buy this. Let's buy a local. Let's get locally sourced things, and they boycotted them so much that it really started bothering the crown.
That's so cool. I didn't know that, V. I did not know those details. That's really cool.
Yeah,
It talks about the power of the people, and I love that. That's so cool. And then I'm guessing that leads to the Boston Tea Party, which, as we were saying, it was led by Samuel Adams, which was I actually, when you go to the Boston Tea Party Museum, and if you are in Boston, you should definitely go. It's probably one of the best museums I've been to in Boston, and I was incredibly impressed and so mad that I hadn't gone before. It took me 5 years to go, but happy that I went, and I recommend everyone to go there. Um, and they
definitely.
actually, when you go into the museum, they bring you into a courtroom, and it's kind of like a courtroom, right? And we have to role play this meeting where we, as Samuel Adams gathers the community, the town, for people to protest and decide on the Boston Tea Party. And then you leave the courtroom and you go into the ship. But basically, the idea is that Samuel Adams led this meeting, asking the people of Boston what their thoughts were on the taxation, and if they were mad, how they felt, and they all decided they wanted to do some form of protest. And so they disguised themselves as Native Americans in the middle of the night and went into the ships. And instead of what was needed to do, which was take out the teas of the ship and of course um, sourced it out to America, they grabbed all the tea chests and dumped it into the sea, right?
Yes. After all that tea was sitting there for a while too. And let's remember too that like a lot of that tea that was exported from all the places in the world, such as India, they had like an expiration date, you
Right.
know. So most of the time, these ships that would come to Boston, they had a time to leave, a time to get there, and people knew that time was such a like crucial thing for them. So that was another form of protesting. Did you know that they used to tax people for playing cards and dice at the time?
What? That's
This is when
crazy.
people went crazy. You know, people were like, we're not everyone were like necessarily British citizens, right? That was a little bit like in Massachusetts. That was a very smooth mixture of slaves and Native Americans, since they were like much more, they were smarter in the North. Of course, they were not necessarily for slave. They weren't necessarily for slavery. You know,
Yeah, they
which
were more educated, right?
it's a huge thing about Massachusetts. It's like it's one of the places from the United States that really also advocated against slavery. You know, the majority of the people that were living in Massachusetts advocated. You know, people that were necessarily even slaves, they advocated because they saw the wrong in this. And that's a major distinction between the North of the United States and the South. The North was more progressive. They had their heads in place. And that's why they're also one of the people that started the fight. You know, they started the revolution. It was in the North. And another place,
Right.
too, as a side note, another place that was really interesting to live to at the time that was very progressive was Philadelphia.
Really?
Because, yes, Philly was a place for free people. You know, like this whole thing of colonies, like in states, it's always been like this. Every different state would have like different rules, different laws, and different dynamics. Philly was the state that didn't have as many laws to control people. And another detail is that Philly was a place that did not have any sort of religion restriction, because Massachusetts at the time had more religious restrictions, even more because the Puritans were there, and like you can see in their names, they wanted to be pure, so they weren't
Right.
necessarily for other religions being in the same place as them. They did coexist with other religions, but it wasn't their thing, you know,
Right.
and that's the thing that was really really interesting. So
That's super cool.
going back to the Boston Tea Party, um, all those issues, all those things were flourishing, and the British Crown had was in so much debt. They needed money. They needed to pay for all that discovery they made. So they started taxing everyone, taxing, 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 and then people woke up and they spoke up, and that's how the revolution started. Because of that, and there were additional details, but mostly that was like we say the last drop, because after
Right.
the revolution started after the Boston Tea Party, that's when a lot of thinkers, politicians, philosophers, and intellectuals of the time decided to unite themselves and kind of create a form of a conference. There was a name of the conference. I guess it's a intercontinental continental conference, something that would lead them to independence. Basically, a group
Right.
of people that were made of mostly there were a lot of like British men, but also American people that were born in the United States. They gathered and they wanted to take the first thing was to reduce the taxes, which was the main objective. They're trying to do it in peace, and then after that, they saw that they couldn't get it. Then it was like the only way is to be independent. So that's kind of
That's
like
very
how
cool.
we got to the path of revolution. And in Boston, we have the Revolution Trail, right? So it's like really interesting because if you go to Boston, you can learn so much more about it, and you can live it. You can go to the different cemeteries. You can go to the different um, buildings that were part of history. On the next slide, well, there's another thing mentioning in this slide here, which is the battles of Lexington and Concord. That was actually a battle between kind of like a part of Massachusetts and a part of New Hampshire. Um, New Hampshire wasn't necessarily an overly populated state at that time, but people used to own a lot of land. And there was a battle between Lexington and Concord. Actually, not between Lexington and
No,
Concord.
not between. I
Not
think I'm pretty
between
sure it's, but
it was
yeah,
actually people. I think it was because in Concord they used to make the thing they used on the guns, right? Like to shoot, because at the time the guns were they would use powder to shoot, and we call it pólvora in Portuguese.
right.
Keep in mind we're from Brazil, so sometimes that can happen.
Yeah.
But basically,
It's gunpowder.
something was going. Yes, gunpowder. Something was going. The gunpowder was going from Concord to Lexington, and I don't know if it was the British that was going from one way to the other, but they got caught.
Yeah, so from what I understand, the story of the battles of Lexington and Concord is basically that it's about Paul Revere. It's when the British, after the Boston Tea Party, the British go and want to capture Samuel Adams and the other people that were part of the Boston Tea Party, and therefore Paul Revere hops on a horse and rides the horse all the way to the battlefield to warn Sam Adams that the British are coming to catch him, and then they engage in a battle in which I am pretty sure they do lose. But
Yeah,
and this also leads to the next battle, which is the Battle of Bunker Hill. But the
yeah,
point, despite the American soldiers losing these battles, it gave a perspective to the Brits that the cost of going to battle was actually really high as well.
yeah. Yes, yes, yes. And they saw that, like, well, there was a return of investment if they got into those battles, but that was a huge investment just to get into those battles. So if they start losing those battles and they spend more time in those battles, eventually one side would decline for financial like reasons, you know.
Right.
Um, but that was interesting because I think that was actually one of the first blood spills, one of the first actual small battles and conflicts that involved the British Crown, and that got them really, really mad, of course. And I
Right.
think we can go to the next slide so we can get a little bit more. Um, okay, so yes. So like there were a lot of British forces not only in Boston. There are a lot of British forces in Boston, in New Haven. There are a lot of British forces on the way to New York, and that was one of the strategies that the British Crown decided to implement. Is to bring as many troops to the north as possible because the north were the ones that were really starting to this revolution. The south was more, south was really comfortable at the time, and I know they had their own issues as well, but they were more comfortable. The north was the more reactive one, and
Right.
in 1800 to 1849, yes, like well, in the 1800 to
And then
1849,
we go, yeah, because
right?
we move out of like the independence era, right? The American Revolutionary War era,
Yeah,
where
yeah,
after George Washington expels the British from Boston, and a few years later Boston becomes completely independent, then we start having the Industrial Revolution and other different revolutions that bring Boston into
yeah.
to be what the city that it is today, right?
Yes, and another thing is like Boston had a perfect geography to start the revolution because of Boston is not necessarily a city full of hills, but it's also not a city that is necessarily plain. So one of the things about the Battle of Bunker Hill is that the colonials they had tanks like cannons, actually not tanks, sorry, cannons on the Bunker Hill Monument because they could see who was coming to the city, who was going out. They had a wider view of everything, and that was one of the places where they shot those cannons, and they had
Wow.
a beach and everything. Yeah, it was like it's interesting because we live in Boston, and when we go around the city, we don't really imagine those places to have that much meaning, you know?
Exactly. That's true. That's true. And it makes us want to like take a second to understand the places that we're around, because it truly is a an honor and a luxury to be standing where we stand, guys.
Yes,
Um
very true. Very true. But then after the main revolution, after the British got kicked out, when the French helped the colony win, and they were like peace deals, and then the United States started actually investing in having like a structure, a parliament, and all that. After all these things, which I definitely recommend everyone to read, it tells you so much. By the way, Boston has always been very diverse. Of course, at that time, because of the Puritans, it wasn't as diverse. But there's something very interesting about New York, which was really close to Boston. There were like in a few older books, you can see how people used to say how that if you walked around the streets of New York, that was one of the only places in the world after the Silk Road where you could hear people speaking 20 to 30 different dialects in the streets selling things, right?
Wow. Wow, that's
It's
crazy.
so crazy because it's still like this nowadays.
It still is. It's
You
genuinely, it
know,
still is. That's
that's
really
so
cool.
cool. Yeah, like New York was like that hub of commerce, and it's like money, and it was highly influenced by French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the British. Those were the four main ones, but there were like in New York, you could do business with the Native Americans too, you know.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that was interesting, the whole influence of the British over the Native Americans, and the dispute between the British and the French to see who could buy the soul of the Native American, like it was really, really interesting to see that those things into perspective back in time, and how how there was, it was so much it was a competition, you know what I mean.
Right.
This
Right.
country, and at the end of the
Completely
day,
competitive.
exactly. And at the end of the day, this competitiveness ended up creating a whole new country that is so diverse until today, until tomorrow. It's one of the most diverse places I've ever been in my whole life, right?
Yeah.
And the history of Boston and the history of the United States explains exactly why it is like this. And if you pay attention at the details, you will actually understand that this country was built by immigrants, that the people that really, really belonged there were the Native Americans, and they are the owners of the land, you know.
Yeah.
But there was a huge
Exactly.
dispute over money, commerce, and to see what country would be the biggest one at the time. If it was Spain, if it was England, if it was Portugal, who ran away from Napoleon and all that. So it's just like it's a good thing to know when you live in the United States how the country was built, what formed this country, what values, you know, and what is this resilience that we have in Boston until today. Like this fighter spirit is still very present.
Still,
So
it still is. It still is. I agree, V. I love that actually. And it's a beautiful thing to know. And to, because we're getting here to the end of the podcast, guys.
yeah,
Just to finish off the history that we've got going as of now. Um, after the industrial revolution begins, there's a large amount of immigrants from Ireland, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of Irish immigrants come into Boston, and then if we actually look at the areas of Boston, we have a couple of areas that are specific to different communities. As for example, Chinatown. There's a lot of Chinese immigration or Asian immigration towards Chinatown, and then
yeah,
we have the North End, which is a lot of Italian immigration.
yeah,
And in Boston in general, there's a lot of Irish immigration. And then if we go to the outskirts of Boston, we find a lot of Hispanic and Brazilian immigration, you know? So
yeah.
it's super interesting to see, as Victor says, the melting pot of cultures that is this beautiful educational hub, you know?
Very true, very true, and that's what makes this city so special, Donna. And as a matter of fact, of course, that was just the root of history. Those four countries I mentioned that were highly influenced, high influence. But then afterwards, when you mentioned it, that when there was an industrial revolution, then Germans arrived, the Italians arrived, and more people from China, more people from all over the world. This country has been based on that, in my eyes. It's
Right.
the
I
presence and
agree.
the drive and motivation to grow and become something bigger that made this city what it is. And we have one of the best universities in the world, the best universities in the world. We have Harvard,
Yes.
MIT. You know, we have Boston University, we have Boston College, we have Emerson College.
Woo.
You know? So
Yes,
it's
I
very
agree.
interesting. It's a city that it's not just worth living, but knowing, understanding, and feeling it. So
I agree, V. It's a city of great history and great future. It truly is. It is a city that will lead the future. Many of the great minds of the future will come from Boston. Will study in Boston. Will have passed through Boston, and that just gives a lot of honor to what Boston is. It gives a lot of importance to what Boston is, to what Boston represents in the life of so many different people, you know?
yeah.
And I think that's really cool. Actually, and because I just saw this on the slide, did you know that the Boston Red Sox used to be called the Boston Pilgrims?
I actually I remember someone mentioning that, but yeah, like I know that
Really?
the Boston Red Sox did change its name. Um, but yeah, I mean, I was never really into sports, but I do know also that like the Red Sox stadium is like one of the oldest stadiums. If it is,
Stadiums?
it's the oldest stadium in America, in the MLB. Um, and that's yeah, that's cool. And how the Patriots also assimilate the name of Patriots as like the people from Boston that fought against the crown and all that. So
Right,
there are a lot
right.
of historical similances and puns on names because of
On
history.
names around. Yes, I agree. I agree. But yes, that's it, guys, for today. That's a brief history of Boston up to the 20th century, so halfway through the 20th century. We would be happy to expand upon this history or take it into other cities. You're welcome to comment and let us know what you guys would like to see. But without further ado, I'm gonna close out this podcast, this episode, guys, and that's it for today. Thank you for tuning in to Approaching Your Future with your hosts, Dana and Victor, where we discuss different cultural aspects of life in the United States. And we will be back next Friday. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn your notifications on. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, approach_USA, to keep up with the latest updates. We post daily. We do live streams almost three times a week. So definitely go check it out, guys. And you're welcome to comment if you have any more suggestions of topics that you guys would like to see. We'd be happy to take it on. And V, do you have any other comments that you'd like to add?
No, just the same as always. I mean, I'm always looking forward to being back here every week. So hopefully we'll see everyone again next Friday with something even more interesting to talk about. And for whoever enjoys history, enjoys the history of Boston, research a little bit. And if you live in Boston, go to the museums, you know, enjoy it. Like take advantage of that. This city has so much to offer. So,
So much.
you know, that's my message.
I agree with you. Truly, truly a beautiful city, and thank you so much for bringing your incredible wisdom, V. It was great to hear it. Honestly, I love history, but I just don't actually know, and I need to learn more history. But it was so cool to see you do all this storytelling because you took us through the journey of Boston.
Well,
Um,
the more you know, the more you know, you need to know more. And the more you know, you don't know
you
anything.
need right. It keeps on growing.
Exactly.
All right,
So,
guys. But thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you guys next Friday at 2 p.m. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn notifications on as always. And we'll see you back here next Friday. Thank you.
thank you, Dana.
Thank you, V.